So good afternoon. I'd just like to say a very warm thank you to Nuno and the team for a fantastic conference so far. Especially today has just been spectacular. I'm going to take you through my project, and I'm really delighted that Scotland is represented at this event. That's very special for us. What I'm going to do is just tell you a little bit about what I do, where we're located, the context that we operate in, and our kind of focus and priorities. So first of all, I put up our project logo, which I think in a way gives a good flavour of what we're about, because here you have the traditional coat of arms for the city of Inverness in the Highlands, which is a camel and an elephant, which is perhaps not what you would be expecting from Scotland, but it is on the stained glass in the townhouse in the centre of Inverness. And there was a travelling fair that used to come to the city. So this is very much about a little flavour of history, and that's something that's really, really important to us, to honour Inverness's history, but also to place it in the now, that we're about operating in a current situation. So we're honouring the history, but we're very much kind of taking that into the present day. And the lettering underneath, which is Latin and says Jusatis, that's a little bit of humour, a little bit of Highland humour, which is Latin for right enough. So that's a kind of Highland expression, which is, how are you doing? You know, everything's okay, right enough. So that's just a wee kind of a little play. So a flavour of really kind of what sort of encapsulates what we're about. Just to give you a little bit of background on Inverness and where it is, and a little bit of information about the Highlands more broadly. The Highlands covers roughly the geographical area of Belgium. So it's a very large area, but the population of Scotland is only 5 million, and the Highlands, the population is very dispersed. So it's equivalent to Finland or to Sweden. It's a very low population. In the rural parts of the area, the population is going down, and Inverness, the population over the last few years has been increasing. So now the population is roughly somewhere in between 60 to 70,000 people, and Inverness has been talked about a great deal as a very fast growing city. So that means a lot of kind of changes have been taking place. The river is one of the most kind of spectacular parts of the city, but architecturally it's not particularly charming. Edinburgh is much more architecturally elegant. Inverness, I would say that the charms are much more submerged. The city doesn't win you over instantly. It takes a little bit of kind of getting under the surface. So this is just a little bit at the top about the fact that Inverness is almost described as a reluctant city. So back in the year 2000, Inverness transformed from being a town into being a city. It was awarded city status. And at this point, it was felt that actually the city required some investment. The city centre was quite dilapidated, and it was important to refresh the city. So that's really where we kind of got involved. There were all sorts of people round the table talking about design. So there would be civil engineers, landscape architects, traffic engineers, and it was felt that that process, all of those people in that room, it was quite not a transparent process for the public. And so we were looking at how to make that process much more engaging for the people who actually live in the city. So at that point, this would be April 2006, the national arts body, which was Scottish Arts Council and is now called Creative Scotland, put some money into appointing a lead artist, and that lead artist worked with the whole design team. So that was April. I came on board in June of 2006, and we also had a young American practitioner called Evie Westmore who worked with us briefly. So there was a kind of trio of us who worked together. So I'm just going to take you through some of our projects, which there are quite a lot of projects here, and they're quite a mix of different things, but this is really just to give you a flavour of how we work. So going back to 2006, the first project that we curated was called Imagining the Centre, and this was a big project and an experiment for the city. There had never been anything like this in the Highlands before. There's not really a strong tradition of the visual arts in the Highlands, much more music and literature, not really performing and visual arts. So we had a project which was 14 artists who were put together in duos. This was Matt Baker's idea, to have almost like enforced marriages of artists coming together. And we took over the whole of the city from 5 a.m. in the morning till the evening. So there was a daytime version of the project and also a kind of transition into nighttime. And there was all sorts of different activities. There were sound works, experimenting with different spaces, public spaces, private spaces. And we activated places like churchyards and shops, the streets. And this particular project was a hugely important one, which I don't think perhaps translates very easily. But this project was by a young artist called Sarah Barnes. She had just graduated from Edinburgh College of Art. This was her first project. And it's called Inverness's Pants. So that, to describe that, that's kind of a humorous insult to say that Inverness is terrible. Inverness's pants. So what we did was the artist had actually designed and hand cut out several hundred pants, and you had to fill in different questions asking you, what would you like to see changed in the city? What do you feel works? What do you feel is not appropriate now that the Inverness is in fact a city and not a town anymore? And one thing that we trialled with this project, and we have continued thereafter, it was a question that came up yesterday when someone was asking, how do you train your audience? And which I thought was a really interesting question. So we've tried something which we employ a team of explainers. And those explainers, the woman on the right-hand side has a large yellow bag, and we train and we brief and we pay people, a team of people, to work with us on the project. So they will chat to the public, they will meet the artists, they will work with the projects, they will note down reactions, and all of that information then fuels us for the future, so that informs our process. It also is a really important opportunity for young people, perhaps for people who are looking to go to music college or to art college, and it helps to provide access to work that they wouldn't otherwise get access to. So that's something that was very, very successful with this project. And what we found was that it was as if we had hit the perfect moment. The projects unfolded on the street, and the public didn't need to be pursued. The public were coming to us with enthusiasm and with ideas. It was as if we had just really hit the ideal moment for this project. And this has really laid the foundation for a lot of the things that have taken place ever since. So this spawned a number of permanent projects as well as temporary ones. This was the very last project. At the end of the evening, we held a big event in a churchyard. It's the most historic churchyard in the whole of Inverness, where the Jacobites were executed. It's a very, very historic spot. And I put this image here because, for me, Inverness didn't really know what it was getting into, but everyone was phenomenally open-hearted and generous with their time. I had members of the council cutting the grass in the graveyard, fixing the lights, doing all sorts of extra bits of work for us, even though they didn't really know why they were doing this. And this event went much, much better than anyone was imagining. And so in a way, I think that's what we've always aimed to do, for everyone to walk away feeling that was incredibly enjoyable and it worked, so that people will be receptive to working again with something, even if, again, they don't really know quite what it is. One of the projects, the permanent projects that grew out of this process, was an installation, and we were asking the city in a previous era, in the Victorian times, the virtues for the city would have been faith, hope, and charity. And in the 21st century, it was felt maybe faith, hope, and charity are not so appropriate anymore. what would the citizens feel are better, a better trio of virtues. And we ran a whole series of different events, texting events, projects with youth groups, with church groups, with all sorts of different groups. And we also hosted a philosopher's salon, which was quite a formal event. And at that, individual speakers had to represent an individual virtue. They had to argue which virtue they felt was the most appropriate. And at the end of that, the artist, Matt Baker, had to decide which three ultimately to choose. And the three that he chose were perseverance, open-heartedness, and insight. And those are represented in an installation in English, Gaelic, and Old Norse. And Old Norse because it represents the northern parts of Scotland, Orkney, Shetland, who speak a different language. So this is the three virtues, this is the installation. And every time a project is completed, we try and involve the people who've been part of that story in some way. So we try to give something back. And this had been very disruptive for all the shops in this area, charity shops, clothes shops, all sorts of different businesses. So we hosted a big event on the street with dance, music, projection. All the shops stayed open, and each shop in the area was invited to have an artist in residence. So the leftover virtues that weren't used for the installation, that they were represented in each one of these businesses. So nothing was wasted, very Highland. Inverness is quite a strong Christian tradition, so quite often we will involve a minister. So in each of the three virtues, we had a minister of a different faith blessing the project. This is another project which we used. We had a temporary project in Imagining the Centre, and then it led to a permanent project. This is a very traditional little market in the centre of Inverness called a Victorian Market. There are 42 independent traders who are based there, and we have a trio of artists called B&W Cart and a duo called Duffy who designed the entranceways. And the theme with a lot of the work here is about trying to bring the wildness of the wider Highland context back into Inverness, because the wild Highlands are just on the periphery, and we're trying to kind of bring a sense of that back into the city centre. This is a project, a street text project, where we were looking at trying to celebrate the built heritage of the city, but not do it in a traditional way with plaques and brochures, try and do something a little bit different. And there are 25 of these stones embedded in the pavement. And the idea is that each one is next to a building, and the building has a special story. So it's very particular. And there's a water theme that runs through all of them. So the vertical words that run off the top of the stone, this one's in Gaelic, they're all kind of watery words. And underneath each one of the stones, there's another contribution. So something has been hidden and buried underneath a stone from maybe a writer or a musician or perhaps someone who lives locally. They've all contributed something that's been put into the street. There's a little Portuguese connection with this project, which I just remembered when I was coming here, which was that all the special team who were installing the stones during this phase of the streetscaping, they were specialists who came from Portugal. And we held a little event in Scotland, to thank them. And we had some special T-shirts printed. So I brought one with me to show you. So I don't know if someone can translate. I understand.
A t-shirt diz água mole em pedra dura, tanto bate até que fura. Agora traduzir isto em inglês, não sei, peço ajuda a traduzir. Soft, it's not easy, but something like soft water in hard stone, hard rock, hard stone.
So I understand it's a proverb. This is how it's described to me. It's a Portuguese proverb. And the proverb is about the soft drip drip of the water eventually erodes the hard stone. And I think, that is a really good message. And that kind of links back to perseverance, open-heartedness and insight. So just a little bit of... So you can see the water words running off the top and then the text. And there's a map with all of the different street texts, so you can follow around the city where these all are. And then these are the cards with the contributions. So all the people who have written, we kept a spare one. So one was hidden under the stone, and we kept one as a kind of as a memory, so that we've got a record of all the contributions from all the different people in the city. I'm going to speed up a little bit because I'm aware that we're kind of under a bit of pressure with time. So a few years later, in 2009, we were asked to host another event, and this time we wanted to celebrate the changes that had taken place. So we started in 2006, looking at what improvements, how we might make an impact on the city, and then 3 years down the line, a number of things had taken place. So we wanted to celebrate those spaces, and there were a number of artists who were invited to be part of Reimagining the Centre. We hosted a public art conference in Inverness. And we had all sorts of projects, flash mob dance event. We yarn bombed the whole of the city. Are you familiar with yarn bombing projects? You are? Wool, where you cover the city in wool. So two artists, Annie Mars and Jen Cantwell, they had giant red pom-poms scattered around the city and arrows, big red wooden arrows that would direct you to different places around the city. And you would find these special places or maybe secret places, like a secret garden that had a giant red crocheted web. So quite special. And this was the graveyard again. This time the gravestone is covered in red wool, and there was also a mausoleum with a kind of river of red wool and crocheted flowers. So it's just very, very special and transformed. And there's a little expression that's been knitted into the graveyard cosy, which is coorie me. And that's kind of Scots for cuddle me. So. And in the evening, we had various things taking place in the Victorian Market. We transformed the space and had DJs. We had dancers. We had a grand piano. We had all sorts of performance and installations to show how the market is actually a real treasure in Inverness, but can be used much more imaginatively than it currently is. So projection. A flash mob event on the left with a group of young people who are living quite a vulnerable situation called the Calman Trust. And then the project on the right is quite an important one. This was an artist called Ginny Hutchison, who's based in Glasgow. And Ginny was really interested in looking at places around the city that are inhabited by the citizens of the city, but they're not maybe the glamorous side. So not the places that you would tell the tourists about, but they're real, they're important. So she looked at, this is under a bridge where people occasionally sleep rough. She looked at the bottom of the car park where their boy racers kind of hang out, and she looked at another place where teenage girls tend to perform to the CCTV cameras. So she picked 7 quite unusual locations around the city, and the idea was that she monitored when the sun covered those spaces and noted down the time. And there was a series of postcards produced where you could follow a path around the city, so a new path, a new way of discovering the city with the time and some poetry that she commissioned. And one of the locations that cropped up with Ginny doing this project, 7 Sunsets, was the multi-storey car park in Inverness. And on the back of that project, the staff got in touch with us to say that they had loved working with artists, but actually would like to do much more. So we were like, fantastic. The car park is quite important in the centre of Inverness because people don't tend to live right in the middle of the city. People travel in from other parts of the Highlands. So every day, that's where people come. That's where they arrive. 1,000 people are in the car park every day. So we've done a few different things, using unusual spaces, using places that are important in the city and experimenting. So One of these was called Getting Up, and that was working with a whole number of artists. We had bands playing, we had interventions, all sorts of different activities. And this one, I kind of threw this one in to show how things have changed a little bit in Inverness. When we first started working in the city, it was all quite unknown. This was a project, Sans Façon Art Duo, and they had this project called Limelight, where they were interested in trying to transform urban space by fixing a spotlight. Could be a square, it could be an ice rink, it could be all over the world. And Inverness was one of the first places that they came to. So we had to turn off all the street lights and get them access to a hotel room for 48 hours so they could film the kind of events that took place. And it's very hard with a still image to show how powerful this piece of work is, but if you look it up online, it's absolutely fascinating how something as simple as a spotlight in the street can completely change people's behaviour and the way that they navigate and inhabit the city centre. But when we asked the street people to turn off the lights and could we have a hotel room, yes, fine, no problem. So everyone is a little bit more used to the questions that we're asking. And this is a project in the car park where this is a weekend series of events. We worked with a skateboarding community, which is quite small in the Highlands, but quite active. They're trying to get a new skate park designed. And we were asked by the Olympics team, did we have any ideas in a year in the run-up to the Olympics? And we came up with the idea of a kind of unusual ceilidh, not a normal ceilidh. Ceilidh is a Scottish dance where you would have it at a wedding or in a village hall, and everyone does traditional dancing. And if you're Scottish, you've been, over your lifetime, to 100,000 ceilidhs, and they're all much the same. And we were wanting to do something different, and really try and make it a bit more fun, a bit more exciting, especially for the younger people. So we got some funding, and representatives from the Olympics actually came up from London, which we were slightly amazed by, to dance in this ceilidh. And we had interviews with the skateboarding community, and so they were speaking little kind of sound bites, and they were talking really passionately about how they feel skateboarding is almost diminished. It's not treated with respect generally, and they feel that that's something they really want to see changed. I've just got a little tiny bit of film of this, which is quite rough film, but I just wanted to give you a flavour of the lighting. We had live musicians, it was very dark, it was quite a kind of grungy sort of event. So I'm just going to... Should I just come out of that? Yeah. Oh, it's still in there now. Is that one? So I'm just going back in there. Mm-hmm. I forgot you put it in there. Okay. Click on it. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So just kind of gives you a wee flavour of it, kind of dark and grungy. I just want to talk a little bit about the urban-rural side to the Highlands. On one hand, Inverness is a kind of administrative hub for the Highlands, and people come from all over the area to use facilities for medical care. The hospital in the centre of Inverness services the whole of the Highlands and Islands. But some of the work that we do is out with Inverness city centre, and it also takes in some of the challenges about working in a kind of rural context, and I thought that might be relevant for where we are. So this was a project in the centre of Inverness. They were redoing a wall, which is a wall, very, very long stretch of wall, which acts as a bit of a portal between one part of the city and another. And that's really what Inverness is. Inverness is a bit of a portal between the Central Belt and the rest of the Highlands and Islands. So this was the brief to the artist, Mike Ingalls, was to come up with a new Highland myth. So there's all sorts of information in this project, but you can read about this on our website. I won't go into it in a lot of detail, but it encapsulates the Picts, the Celts, the kind of wild side of the Highlands, as well as Inverness's almost kind of old-fashioned values. So there's a lot in this project. So it was a new Highland myth. And this was a project which we were looking at a particular context, which was an eco-housing fair that was being hosted in Inverness. And we commissioned a piece of work by Zoe Walker and Neil Bromwich. And the idea was that this would be a travelling piece of work that would start in one particular location, the housing fair, where all sorts of architects and people, quite innovative practitioners working in different methodologies, were interviewed, and they were recorded on a soundtrack, and that soundtrack was inside this conch shell. So this small travelling artwork is meant to conjure up the idea of a conch shell that you would kind of listen at your ear as if you're listening to the sea. And as this piece of work travelled around different locations, the soundtrack grew and developed. So we took this piece of work to up to the north of Scotland, to Caithness, where there's an international surfing festival. So they have a very different impression there about what the challenges to the planet, to survival, to community living. We took it to Culloden Battlefield, which is a very, very emotionally sensitive place in Scottish history. And we took it to a medical centre where there's a lot of work being done on moving away from giving people medication, looking much more at diet and well-being in a holistic way. So the soundtrack kind of grew and developed as the work travelled all over the Highlands. And then we were invited to take it down to Edinburgh Art Festival, to a place called Jupiter Artland, which is a privately owned art project in the outskirts of Edinburgh. So that's one project. And very quickly run through Sublime. This is a programme of, initially was going to be 3 months of work, and it ended up being 14 months of projects. And the idea was to use the car park as a location, and we sat down with the team there to come up with different ideas for events. And we used the theme of Sublime really in terms of transformation, that you've got a building which is not maybe so seductive or glamorous, which is really, how we tend to think of Inverness on the surface, but actually you can do a lot with that. That's a kind of challenge to play with. So we had events taking place in the basement. We had a theme of hell, purgatory, and heaven. We had all sorts of things that opened with a rooftop film programme and a world premiere of a film by 2 Scottish artists, Graham Rodger and Kevin Reid, who had involved lots of people in film that they hadn't actually seen. So a lot of the people who were actually in the film came to the premiere. There was installation by Nicholas Prevost, by Francis Elise. We had Gaelic performances. We had heavy metal. We had all sorts of things over the 14 months. We had physical theatre, very, very full-on performance of Faust, a one-person show. And projection animation by the performer himself. We had a car project, which is a little bit different from Sylvia's, in that we asked the residents of Inverness if they would like to volunteer their cars to us, and those cars would be transformed by a number of artists. And initially, we thought this might be something we get 1 or 2 cars for. But for some reason, this really seems to grab the public's imagination. And we had 30 vehicles volunteered. Everyone loved it. The TV cameras came, everyone. The artists were delighted that their grandmas and their cousins had all sort of seen them on TV. And we got asked to do another one of these events. And still people are coming forward to volunteer their vans and their campers and their... and the artists met the owners of the cars. So in the bottom right, this is an artist called Rue 5. And the man who owns the van, his name is Trevor. So he's got a little quote from an Ian Dury song, Clever Trevor. So the artists kind of interacted with the owners, although the owners were not allowed to dictate in any shape or form what the work was going to be like. And this is some of the owners. And we do a lot of outreach and networking projects. We employ a lot of young people when we're doing events. And young people in the Highlands don't tend to get access to a really broad range of visual arts practice, so we take it really seriously to try and rope them in as much as we possibly can. They write blogs for us, they help out, and we kind of try to help them on their way when they're wanting to go on to become, to attend art college or get into the next stage of their lives. Another one we had a series of projects every Friday. So every Friday we'd go into the car park and you know that something would be happening in the building, but you wouldn't know where and you wouldn't know what. So we called them Freaky Fridays. And this one there's a very well-known biker who's a bit of a YouTube phenomenon. He's from the island of Skye. His name's Danny McCaskill. I don't know if anyone has heard of Danny. But he produces fantastic films of his work. And we screened one of the films called Industrial Revolution next to a piece of work by Rosie Newman. She covered this car in moss, and inside there was a sound of birdsong. So to set the scene, outside in Inverness is a snowstorm with 4 feet of snow, and you come in from the snow into the car park, and you can smell and you can hear the sounds of spring. So these were meant to kind of lift your spirits at a time of year when when perhaps you're feeling a little bit worn down by the rain and by the snow. And this was the final of the Freaky Fridays, which was a kind of heaven installation. So you came into the car park and there was a soundtrack talking to you about utopia and all sorts of fabulous kind of messages. And you walked into the lifts and you were kind of transported up to heaven. So this is the second one of the car events that we did. We did it in a different location. And there's a lot more different kind of variety of vehicles. And this is Loch Ness, where the monster resides. I don't think we have time for little films, so I'll just keep going. Just coming to the end really now. This is the final part of Sublime was looking at the seascape, not just the landscape, not just thinking about urban space and about physical environments, but also thinking that the coast and the sea is incredibly important in the Highlands. And more, we're looking at renewable energy. Different companies are coming to ask advice from marine biologists, how their work impacts on dolphins, on sea mammals. And it seemed as though this was a kind of good moment to engage with Aberdeen University, who have a field research station in Cromarty on the Black Isle. And we hosted 2 residencies, one of which was more kind of film work, and another one which the artist is a visual artist and also a composer, electronic composer. So he composed an album. So we had all sorts of different activities. We had 1,200 people coming through the lighthouse, which is a fantastic location to have your studio in. And we had 1,200 people come through. We linked in with the British Science Festival, which is a big science event. Takes place, a lot of the world's media kind of keeps track of what's going on there. We had all sorts of talks and workshops involving different schools. So this is just to give a flavour of the water and of the coastal side of things that's equally important. And Culloden Battlefield, which I mentioned earlier. Culloden is an incredibly pivotal moment in Scottish history. The Battle of Culloden is where really life completely changed for Scotland. in 1746. In the space of an hour, on the 16th of April, over 1,500 people were killed in less than an hour. And on the other side of the battle, the casualties were more like 50. So it was a very uneven situation. And it wasn't as simple as thinking it's the English fighting the Scottish. It was much, much more complex. People were split in their families. But it's a very significant site. And we were looking at how an organisation like the National Trust for Scotland, who is the host for this site, how they can be more imaginative and refresh how people interact with that place. And we had some artists who worked with us and who composed music. We hosted a big event on the anniversary of the battle. Every year on the 16th of April, people come from all over the world. They come from France, Canada, and dressed in plaid to mark their clan. And that was filmed by this duo. And then in the evening, we had Gaelic performance and the images of the people who were actually at the anniversary event. And it's a very, very poignant moment to be on the field because it feels really emotionally charged. So to hear Gaelic song when you're actually at Culloden at that moment is very, very powerful. And then finally, just touching on another project in the west of Scotland in an area called Coyach and in a place called Achotubui. This is important for us because this place represents a lot of the issues for fragile rural communities in the Highlands more generally. So things like dropping population, trying to hold on to young people, different opinions about renewable energy, having physical buildings, people struggling with employment, a lot of things taking place in a community of 250 people. And they have been building a community skiff boat, a large wooden boat, and this is a bit of a zeitgeist moment. The skiff movement seems to have really taken off, and Neville Gaby has been following the story of this and what a sort of transformation it has been, how incredibly powerful it's been for this small community to build this boat and to compete. And this summer, the International Skiff Championships are being hosted in Ullapool, just next to Achotubui. So this is a kind of live project for us. So in some ways, it's a small budget. It's following a particular story, but it is something much bigger than just the boat. It's how it's activated that community and the impacts it's having. And this is where we're at right now. We have a series of projects that we've been fundraising for over the last year for the River Ness. And we've been working with two local high schools, to an Architecture and Design Scotland, which is the national agency for Scotland. And we have been working with them to ask the young people of the city to map the river, to talk to us about what they would like to see changed. They've got some amazing ideas, from very small, very modest, to very ambitious and expansive ideas. They've been filming each other. We've got a 10-minute film about all of their ideas, which you can look at another time. But this is kind of the future for us, looking at how young people can be an active part of the conversation in the city and actually be involved in design projects, not just talking to us, but actually being an active partner in a process of change. So that's me.